All right, so today we're going to be looking at Thai Telecom. You sent us this letter, and it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it really gives you a sense of how some of these like policy decisions get made. Behind the scenes,
Yeah.
you see these two different viewpoints on how to boost competition in Thailand's mobile market.
And our professor, Peter Cramton, he's not just some academic, sitting in an ivory tower. This guy's got emeritus professor at the University of Maryland. He founded a market design firm.
Yeah, he's got serious street cred.
This is like real world stuff for him.
Exactly. And that really comes through in the letter. Like he's not just, diagnosing the problems. He's actually proposing a solution.
So, okay, before we get into that solution, to set the scene for us a little bit, Thailand's mobile market kind of is a two-horse race, right? True and AIS.
Yeah, it's basically a duopoly, especially after this recent merger. And the NBTC, which is their regulatory body, is trying to, inject some competition. And they're pushing for these things called MVNOs. They're basically like smaller phone companies that lease network space from the big guys.
Okay, so they're kind of like subletting.
But for mobile networks.
Yeah, exactly.
And the NBTC, they set these rules about how much capacity the big companies have to lease out and at what price. But the consultant in the letter points out a big problem: enforcement.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Cramton acknowledges it, too. It's a valid concern.
Well, yeah, if True and AIS are already dominating the market, why would they want to help smaller companies get a foothold?
Yeah, that's exactly what Cramton's saying. He's arguing that duopolies like this are inherently prone to collusion.
Collusion?
Yeah, think about it. Like, two gas stations across the street from each other. They could compete on price, try to undercut each other, but they both make more money if they just keep prices high.
Right, so they have an incentive to not play nice.
Exactly.
Okay, but isn't that illegal?
It is, but proving collusion is incredibly difficult. And Cramton points out that even in the U.S., similar regulations have struggled with enforcement.
Wow.
So,
enforcement is a problem. So what's the solution? Now, Cramton has this big idea, the TIMO.
TIMO.
What's some more?
So TIMO stands for Thailand Independent Market Operator. And it's essentially like a neutral referee for the whole mobile market.
Okay.
So instead of relying on the big players to lease out capacity directly to these MVNOs, which obviously opens the door to, foot dragging and backroom deals, TIMO would create this centralized, transparent system where this capacity is traded.
Okay, so instead of True and AIs being in charge of the network space, there's this independent entity, TIMO, that's managing it all.
Exactly. TIMO would be the go-between, making sure everyone has fair access and preventing the duopoly from manipulating the market.
But wouldn't that be super complex? I mean, setting up this whole new entity, designing all the rules, making sure it's actually fair, that just sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It's definitely a valid concern, and it's something I'm sure the consultant brought up.
Yeah.
But Cramton argues that it can be done. He even puts a timeline on it.
Okay.
2 years.
2 years to design and implement this thing. That is ambitious.
It is.
But I guess the question is, what's the payoff? Why should we care about some complicated system in Thailand's mobile market?
Because ultimately, it's about better options for consumers.
Right.
More competition means better prices, more innovative services, a more dynamic market overall.
So if TIMO works, Thai consumers would see lower phone bills, faster internet, more choices.
Exactly. Crampton's arguing that this market-based solution would be more effective, more sustainable, and ultimately more beneficial for everyone than simply trying to force the existing players to change their behavior through regulation alone.
I gotta say, this TIMO thing, it's a pretty radical idea. I'm intrigued. How does he imagine this would actually work on a day-to-day basis?
Well, he makes some pretty interesting comparisons to other industries, particularly the electricity market.
Hold on. Electricity? Yeah. That doesn't sound very telecom to me. What's the connection?
Well, that's where Crampton's expertise in market design really shines. He points out that both electricity and mobile communications, they're both network industries, and they both face this challenge of balancing supply and demand in real time.
Okay, so like if everyone's streaming videos on their phones at the same time, the network could get overloaded, just like a power grid during a heat wave.
Exactly. And in electricity markets, they've developed these sophisticated systems to manage those fluctuations using pricing signals to incentivize efficient use of capacity.
Okay.
And Cramton argues that similar principles could be applied to the telecom market through TIMO.
So instead of setting like a fixed price for network capacity, TIMO would create a system where prices fluctuate.
Yeah.
Based on demand, kind of like surge pricing on ride-sharing apps.
Yeah, you got it. and those price signals
Yeah.
would encourage MVNOs to be more strategic about how and when they use capacity.
Okay.
It would also give the big players an incentive to invest in expanding their networks, knowing they could sell that extra capacity at a premium during peak times.
So this is starting to sound a lot more like a free market than a regulated one.
In a way, yes. Cramton's argument is that by designing the market correctly, you can harness the power of competition to achieve the outcomes you want, in this case, a more vibrant and consumer-friendly mobile market in Thailand.
I'm curious to hear more about the nuts and bolts of how this would actually function. What kind of specifics does he lay out?
So he dives into quite a bit of detail in the letter, but I can highlight a few key points to give you a sense of the vision. First off, TIMO would need like a robust trading platform where MVNOs could bid on network capacity. Cramton actually mentions that his team has already built a state-of-the-art platform that could be adapted for Thailand.
So they're not just talking the talk, they've actually built the tools to make this happen.
Exactly. This platform would use algorithms to determine the most efficient allocation of capacity, taking into account real-time demand, network constraints, the bids submitted by the MVNOs, all that stuff.
Okay, that sounds pretty high-tech. But how do we know it would actually be fair to everyone involved? I mean, wouldn't True and AI still have an advantage since they own the actual infrastructure?
Well, that's a key point that Cramton addresses. He argues that TIMO would be designed to maximize social welfare, meaning it would take into account the interests of consumers, MVNOs, and the big telecom operators.
But how do you please everyone, especially in a market that's been so dominated by a few powerful players?
It's not about pleasing everyone. It's about creating a system where everyone has an incentive to participate and to play by the rules. And Cramton argues that TIMO's market-based approach would do just that.
Okay, I'm starting to see the logic here. But wouldn't the big guys, True and AIS, just try to game the system? I mean, they've got a lot of experience in this market, and they know how to pull strings.
Yeah, Cramton anticipates that pushback. But he argues that TIMO's rules and algorithms would be specifically designed to prevent that kind of manipulation, to ensure a level playing field. Plus, he points out that True and AIS would still benefit from a more competitive market.
Really? How so? Wouldn't more competition mean less profit for them?
Not necessarily. Think of it this way. A bigger pie benefits everyone. If there are more MVNOs offering a wider range of services, that's going to drive overall demand for mobile data. And True and AIs, as the owners of the underlying network infrastructure, they would ultimately profit from that increased demand.
So it's not about taking power away from the big guys. It's about creating a system where everyone can thrive.
Exactly. And Cramton argues that TIMO would be more effective than traditional regulation because it wouldn't rely on trying to force True and AIs to act against their own self-interest.
Okay, that makes sense. If you make it profitable for them to play fair, they're more likely to do it. But I still have this nagging doubt. Would this actually work in practice? Thailand's a complex place, and I've heard stories about corruption and bureaucracy.
Those are legitimate concerns, and to be fair, Cramton acknowledges that there would be challenges, uncertainties, but he points to the success of similar market-based approaches in other industries, like electricity.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier. But electricity is different. It's literally essential for modern life. Can you really compare it to something like mobile data?
Well, it's true. Mobile data is not like life or death, but it is becoming increasingly vital in today's world. Think about how much we rely on our smartphones for everything, from business to education to staying connected with loved ones.
Okay, you got a point there. Mobile data is definitely not a luxury anymore. It's pretty essential for a lot of people.
Exactly. And the principles of market design that have worked in electricity could be adapted to address the specific challenges of the telecom market.
All right, I'm willing to keep an open mind. But even if TIMO could work in theory, wouldn't it be incredibly difficult to implement in the real world? I mean, this is a major overhaul of Thailand's entire mobile market.
It would definitely be a complex undertaking. Cramton estimates a 2-year timeline for designing and implementing TIMO in Thailand.
2 years. That seems incredibly fast for something this big. What makes him so confident?
He mentions that the real bottleneck is the regulatory stakeholder process, getting everyone on board, hammering out the details. But he seems to believe that the technical aspects of building the platform and designing the market mechanisms are achievable within that time frame.
So the technology isn't the problem. It's the politics.
That seems to be his assessment. And he even argues that the upcoming spectrum auction in mid-2025 could be a catalyst for TIMO.
Wait, a spectrum auction. Remind me what that is again?
So it's basically when the government auctions off licenses to use different frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum. which are necessary for wireless
Oh,
communication.
like radio waves and stuff. But how does that tie into TIMO?
Well, Cramton suggests that if the MVTC signals its intention to create TIMO before the auction, bidders would factor that into their bids. They'd know that the market landscape is about to change.
So it's about setting expectations and creating momentum for reform. That's clever.
Exactly. Cramton sees the TIMO proposal as more than just a technical solution. It's a way to shift the entire conversation about competition in Thailand's mobile market.
This whole thing is fascinating, but it's also a lot to process. What are the key takeaways for someone like me, a non-economist, trying to understand what's at stake here?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there are innovative market-based solutions to problems that traditional regulation often struggles to address.
Okay, that's a good one. What else?
Another key point is that competition is not a zero-sum game. It's possible to create a system where everyone benefits: consumers, smaller players, and even the big incumbents.
Right, that whole bigger pie idea.
Exactly. And finally, I think Crampton's letter highlights the importance of thinking outside the box and being willing to challenge the status quo.
I love that. It's easy to get stuck in the same old debates, but sometimes you need a radical new approach to break through the gridlock.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This chemo proposal is definitely making me think differently about how we create a more competitive and dynamic telecom market. It's ambitious, but it's also incredibly exciting.
It really is, and it raises some intriguing questions about whether similar approaches could be applied to other industries, even beyond Thailand.
Ooh, now that's a thought-provoking idea. Maybe we should do a whole deep dive on that sometime.
I'm always up for a challenge.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's wrap up our discussion of this letter. Any final thoughts for our listener?
I think the most important thing is to keep in mind that this is just one perspective on a complex issue. Crampton's letter is a starting point for a conversation, not the final word.
Great point. It's important to consider all sides of the debate and weigh the potential benefits and challenges of any proposed solution.
Exactly. And I would encourage our listener to do their own research and form their own opinions about whether TIMO is the right approach for Thailand.
That's great advice. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about. But it's really just the beginning.
It is. There's a whole world of information out there.
About telecom markets, regulatory policy, and market design.
And we encourage you to explore it. Who knows? Maybe you'll be the one to come up with the next big idea for revolutionizing the industry.
Now that would be something to see. All right, that's a wrap for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey into the world of Thai telecom.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time. He actually gives some specific examples, too, of how TIMO would handle the day-to-day details of the market. Like, for instance, he talks about how network capacity would be divided into different categories based on factors like location, time of day, type of service.
Okay. Primetime bandwidth in Bangkok would be more expensive than late-night data in a rural area.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about reflecting the actual value of that capacity at any given moment. And MVNOs would bid on the specific capacity slots that they need to serve their customers.
Okay, I'm starting to see how the market dynamics would play out. But what about the pricing? How would TIMO actually set the prices for all these different capacity slots?
So this is where it gets a little technical, but basically, Crampton argues that TIMO would use a system that essentially boils down to surge pricing for mobile data. When demand is high, prices go up. And that encourages MVNOs to either pay a premium or find ways to reduce their usage.
Kind of like how ride-sharing apps charge more during rush hour.
Exactly.
And I'm guessing those higher prices would also give True and AIS an incentive to invest in expanding their networks to meet that demand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Makes sense. It's all about creating that balance between supply and demand.
Exactly. And Crampton believes that this dynamic pricing model would be way more efficient and responsive than traditional regulation, where prices are often set by the government and can be really slow to adjust to changing market conditions.
Okay, I see the appeal of this TIMO idea. But even with all these clever mechanisms, there's still a chance that True and AIS could find ways to game the system right. I mean, they've got a lot of experience in this market, and they're not exactly known for playing by the rules.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Crampton acknowledges that risk. But he argues that TIMO would be designed with safeguards to prevent that kind of manipulation and ensure fair play. There'd be strict rules about transparency and data sharing, and independent auditors would monitor the market to detect any suspicious activity.
So kind of like having referees watching the game to make sure no one's cheating.
Exactly. And if any foul play is detected, there would be penalties, sanctions to discourage bad behavior.
Okay. That makes me feel a little better. But even with all those safeguards, this still sounds like a pretty ambitious undertaking. Is Cramton really serious about this, or is this just like a theoretical exercise?
He seems deadly serious. In fact, he even addresses that concern directly in the letter about, TIMO being too complex or too slow to implement. He argues that it can be done within 2 years and that the benefits outweigh the challenges.
2 years. That is incredibly fast for something this big. What makes him so confident?
Well, he points to the fact that his team has already developed this state-of-the-art trading platform that could be adapted for Thailand. And he argues that the real bottleneck is the regulatory stakeholder process. Getting everyone on board, hammering out the details.
But the technology's not the problem, it's the politics.
That seems to be his assessment. And he even suggests that the upcoming spectrum auction in mid-2025 could be a catalyst for TIMO.
Ah, yes. If the NBTC signals its intention to create TIMO before the auction, then bidders would know that the rules of the game are about to change.
Exactly. It's all about setting expectations and creating momentum for reform.
This whole TIMO proposal is really making me rethink how we approach these issues. Competition and innovation, it's bold, it's ambitious, and it sparked a lot of questions in my mind.
Mine too. And I think that's kind of the point of this letter. It's a call to action, to think differently about how we create a more dynamic and consumer-friendly mobile market.
Well said. So to wrap things up, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we shouldn't be afraid to challenge the status quo, especially when it comes to these kinds of issues. Promoting competition, fostering innovation. Sometimes we need to think outside the box and consider radical new approaches.
Absolutely. And this TIMO idea is a perfect example of that. It's a reminder that there are creative solutions out there, even for really complex problems.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Thai telecom and the bold ideas shaping its future.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.